Today's speaker is Robert Livesay. He is a renowned photographer of our area, and he has been on his pictures have been on the cover of the phone book for the last 4 years, and has even appeared on CNN. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm not much of a podium guy, I'm more of a percher, so I think I'll just perch on this table here. They just asked me to come and talk, so I don't know exactly what you folks want to know. I think this one's not going to last. So I brought my calendars, I brought my books, and I also brought a folder of some sort of cutting-edge photography things. So maybe I'll throw it out to you folks. Would you like to hear, something about what it's like to photograph pelicans on Grand Lake? And are there photographers out here that would like, some tips on how to do that? Or is that a good place to start? I see some heads nodding yes. Well, the way I got started, we've been fortunate enough to have a home on the lake for about 18 or 19 years. But for the first 10 years, we were running a business in California and going back and forth. We got out here full-time about 5 or 6 years ago. I was already photographing quite a bit, but having a home on Grand Lake and being there full-time, I was just so taken by the beauty that I started photographing more and more. And pelicans have a little bit of a mystique around the lake, and my home's actually out in what's now Patricia Island. When I bought my home, there wasn't any Patricia Island. There was just Dixon Cattle Ranch in my place. But we look right out at what some people call Weed Island. My wife and I call it Bird Island, but that's one of the main pelican hangouts. So right out my window, I could see whenever pelicans were out there in force. And I could also see what the water conditions were like. So I began to photograph them more and more and started submitting some of my pictures, and people liked them. And then the digital age continued to evolve, and 10 years ago, if you wanted to do this book, well, you'd have to get with a publisher and have them print 5,000 or 10,000 of them and do a big investment and hope you sold them. Well, now you can find some good online companies. They have templates. I think at last count I had like maybe 90,000 images on my big external hard drive. So I thought, it's time I organized those images, put them together, and started throwing them into some templates. And then, by the way, have most people seen this book?
Yeah.
I'll be glad to pass a couple around for those that haven't. Those that have can just pass them. But what I tried to do was systematize some of my photos, put them together in chapters, and talk a little about pelican behavior, what they normally did, how they fished, and how they flew, and so forth. Because out of those images, I bet I probably got maybe, over 1,000 hours photographing pelicans. So there's a lot of watching them and hanging out with them. I think one of the reasons I was able to get pretty good pictures, not only do I have good equipment and a good telephoto, but the birds got so used to me being out there in my boat, they let me float up almost in among them sometimes. The other thing I did once I got going, I was pretty devoted, so some of the pictures, you'll see one picture in my book that was taken in a full-on snowstorm in late December, early January. There weren't a lot of other boats out on the lake that day, it was just me all bundled up. But the chance, white pelicans are a fairly tropical bird, and that was a winter that more of them stayed than usual. Those of you that are on the lake know that a few stayed all year. In fact, this year, at least 200 or 300 did. I saw them last in bunches down below the dam when it was real cold. There were the water coming out below the dam. But I would get out there and just photograph them in unusual habitat, like some of the pictures with ice behind. They don't hang around when there's ice usually, so that was an unusual occurrence in a full-on snowstorm. That was enough to get me out there in my boat, and because it was just so unusual. So I figured I've got all this time with pelicans, I'll just get on the internet, get with a good company, and get a book out there and see what people think, and the response has been very, very favorable. So that's a quick introduction. Oh, yeah, I tell this to people. As my photography began to unfold and I was out here at Grand Lake, there came a point where I knew that this photography was a really good deal. I've always loved boats, I've always loved the water. I'm also a licensed therapist. I do a counseling practice in town, so I work hard, but I always love to be out on my boat. So the time I knew that wildlife photography was going to be a good deal, There was one time when I was shooting a lot of pelicans. We'd been here full time for just a few months, and I'm headed out for about the 4th day to shoot, and my wife looks, Bob, where are you going? So, I'm working, honey. I'm in my boat, on the water, working. I liked it. And I've continued to take a lot of wildlife photography. I've branched out. I'm doing some additional event and wedding and mild portrait stuff, but I would say wildlife is still my first love. So that's a very quick introduction. Any questions along the way, things you'd like to know about pelicans or about photographing pelicans? Or
They don't really talk to each other, do they? They just kind of croak or grunt?
About their only sound is a low grunting sound. Yeah. They're usually pretty darn quiet. And the other thing that I talked about in my book is they are very, not only communal, but they
Telepathic or
really, they do the same thing at the same time very, very often. They really stick together, and when one does something, they tend to all do it.
How do they essentially all know? I've seen them do this. They would almost take off at the same exact time.
I'm not sure anyone knows.
And I hear no sound.
That's true. And I've never seen like a guard pelican like you see with the Canada geese, you know, where the one's always up, you know. I've never seen a designated leader, but they just seem to have a real pack or pod mentality. They seem to me also to be pretty darn gentle by nature. Although, you can see a couple of my pictures in there when they were in their full-on hunting mode. They're maybe I'll flip to that real quick for those of you. Their demeanor would change when you saw them all amped up and about to go hunting. Yeah, like this picture right here. They were much more purposeful than you usually see them. You know, when they've got a bunch of shad all herded together, you can tell that they're on point, and it's different than the usual hanging around kind of deal. Occasionally they will hunt. They'll fly and dip in the water real quick. It's not the usual behavior, but I talk about in this one chapter. One day they would fly, maybe 50 feet, about 3 or 4 feet off the water, and they'd see something, and then they'd dive in together. But usually, as I talk about in the book, just get in more or less circles, herd the shad into shallow water or somewhere where they're likely to be able to scoop them up in large numbers. And those of you on the lake know they also fish a lot with cormorants. You'll see them in large moving groups of birds.
His sister lives in Grand Isle, Louisiana. It's a barrier island off the coast.
Uh-huh.
Well, every March she has to call me and say, March or April, well, the white pelicans are on your way because they just left. And about 5 days later, they arrive here on Grand Lake.
That's a good story. I'll remember.
So then we do the reverse in September and October. We call her when they're getting ready to
move on.
Well,
Whatever.
that's one thing I'll put out of this juncture. One thing I've really enjoyed about being full-time here on Grand Lake and doing photography is I have a little network now of people that know the kind of photography I do. So if they see something interesting going on in their backyard or nearby, like a new fox den or like some wood ducks that are hanging out and hatching, anything photograph, or an albino squirrel, they'll give me a call. So I invite you folks, I'll have some cards up at the end if you see something unusual. And usually if I photograph at your place, I'll give you a photo for the trouble. So it's fun to have a kind of wildlife network because it helps you get where the action is.
It's so amazing that people on the East Coast didn't know we had white pelicans. I had a cousin that came back in the fall, and I showed her your book, and she bought it. She said, I didn't know you all had white pelicans here. I said, yeah, that's our claim to fame.
Just one of the many things that people don't know about Oklahoma.